and welcome to this LSE Atheist, Secularist and Humanist Society joint with Philosophy Society talk tonight with A.C. Grayling. I'm Simon Glendinning and I'm the Professor of European Philosophy here at LSE, working in the European Institute. Now, many of you will know tonight's speaker from books on atheism and on faith, perhaps the God argument, on religion. I became aware of him, however, first when I was an undergraduate student, from a brilliant introductory book that he wrote not on religion, but on philosophical logic. I was actually floundering at the time, I must say, and I ended up getting it first, so thank you for that. Well, between religion and logic, he seems to have written about everything in between, on great historical figures in the history of philosophy, such as Descartes, Berkeley, Russell, Wittgenstein, on ethics and on value, on truth and meaning. It's an incredible breadth and a great teacher. Somebody who really brings people in to the subject, an introduction in the literal sense of bringing somebody in. Now, of course, he's a master of the New College of Humanities here in London, and he was formerly Professor of Philosophy at Berkeley. I think he counts as the, if not one of the, leading public figures in philosophy, speaking about philosophy, about the arts, about humanities, about literature, quite often about film too. It's our great pleasure to have him with us here this evening. He's going to speak hopefully for about 40 minutes or so, and then there'll be some time for questions from you to follow. So for now, please welcome A.C. Grayling.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Simon, for that. Thank you. Well, I've been asked to talk tonight on the question, is atheism just a matter of faith? And in the original invitation, there was a supplementary question too, which is, does evil in the world undermine belief in the existence of deity? And I would like to say something about that topic as well. But I'll concentrate on this one first. And I'll begin by making some very familiar points. I mean, you've had them before, I'm sure, but it is important from the point of view of positioning what atheism is, to recognize its relation to two other important isms which lurk in this field, secularism and humanism. Atheism, the debate over atheism, or between atheists and theists, is a metaphysical debate. It's a debate about what exists or doesn't exist, either in or in some way related to the universe. The secularism debate is about the place of religious organizations or the religious voice in the public square and its influence on public policy matters. So you can see that the two are really rather different. It's quite natural, I suppose, for atheists to be secularists, that is to think that non-secular organizations that have a theistic commitment of one kind or another, should not have an overweening presence in the public square. But I think a self-respecting secularist would say this, that religious organizations, religious bodies, religious movements should see themselves for what they are, which is special interest groups. So they have a set of beliefs, they have a view about how those beliefs should impact social behavior and political decisions, and they put their case, and of course they're completely entitled to do that, but not with any greater privilege, not with any greater advantage than other interest groups, like trade unions, for example, any kind of NGO, if you like, or the Women's Institute and beyond. All those organizations have a right to exist and a right to have their say. But for historical reasons, in most societies, religious bodies tend to have too much of a chance to get to the head of the queue quickly, too much of a place in this country. For example, in England rather than the United Kingdom, there is even indeed an established church. And so, naturally enough, the religious voice tends to be heard at high table in all discussions in our society. And the secularist argument is that that shouldn't be so. And of course, there are religious secularists. There are people of religious commitment who don't think that religion should have that kind of a position in society. certainly religious people or organizations which happen to be in the minority in a given society. So if you lived in a country where one church or one religious outlook was dominant and you were a member of a minority religion, you might be quite keen that the dominant religion shouldn't have final say on matters of public policy. Indeed, secularism began as a church argument in the medieval period because the church didn't want the temporal powers interfering in its business, and they therefore argued that there should be a separation of church and state, but of course only in one direction. The church wanted to continue to interfere in the temporal business of the state, but they didn't want the opposite to happen, and that is pretty well how things have been ever since. And then the third of the isms is humanism, and it happens that that is my primary interest, although I won't talk about it much this evening unless somebody wants to ask me a question about it. But humanism is fundamentally an ethical and social standpoint, and it has its roots very, very deep in the philosophical tradition, all the way back to, indeed, the debate about matters of ethics in classical antiquity. For my money, Socrates and Aristotle were among the very first humanists, because the assumption on which they based their thinking about how we answer questions, about how we live, what values we shape our lives by, are predicated on the idea that the answers must be ones that we've thought out for ourselves, on the basis of our best understanding of human nature and the human condition. But thinkers like Socrates and Aristotle and others didn't think that there was a power in the universe possessing the answers to that question about how we're to live and what we're to be, handing it down, so to speak, from on high, a kind of divine command morality, such as you find, for example, in Christianity and Islam. But instead, those individuals have this very deep responsibility to think about how they're going to live and what choices they're going to make. And a really, really significant difference, therefore, between the humanist outlook and any religion-based morality is that, just to put matters in a rather brief form, religion-based moralities tend to assume, often without really challenging this view, that there is a kind of one-size-fits-all answer to the question of how we should live and what we should be, namely in conformity with the demands or the invitation or the dictates, however you want to put it, of the divinity in question. Whereas, of course, what Socrates was assuming when he said to his fellow Athenians, you've got to think for yourself about how you're going to live. You have to consider your life. You remember, since you were all reading Plato and the Bath last night, you will remember this, that Socrates said the unconsidered life is not worth living, the life not thought about and chosen. And the premise of that idea, of course, is that there might be as many different ways in which lives can be valuable, meaningful, flourishing, as the individuals who live them. Because one of the great premises of ancient Greek thinking about this matter was that we have to achieve some self-understanding. We have to have some insight into how things are for our fellow human beings. And that, of course, would involve recognition of great diversity and variety that there is in human nature and human circumstance. And that, therefore, the humanist outlook says there will be many, many different ways that people can live and choose to live. You can see how this tradition worked its way right through the philosophical tradition, because in Mill, John Stuart Mill, in his lovely little essay on liberty, he says, the thing that worries me more than political tyranny is social tyranny, that society would require of its members that they adopt only one way of living, whereas it would be of great value if people tried many different experiments in how to live good and flourishing lives, providing, of course, they follow what's called the harm principle, which is that we mustn't harm others in the pursuit of our own good and in trying to nurture our own best relationships with others. So humanism is a non-religious ethical outlook premised on the idea that we have individual responsibilities to think about things, and in particular, of course, because we are essentially social animals, because we need our relationships with one another. We need to love and to be loved, to have friendships, to be parts of communities. So thinking about our values, therefore, means thinking about how we live with others. And so the humanist demand really is to think how we're to make the very best, not just of our own individual lives, but of our relationships and our communities. So that is the third ism, and as I say, it's one that very much interests me. I've written a bit about it, very happy to talk about it in the Q&A session. But let us get back to matters of metaphysics. to the question whether or not atheism is a matter of faith. Well, of course, the very first thing one must do, as Simon will tell you, as a professor of philosophy, our first task in these debates is always to clarify our terms. So what do we mean by faith? Well, one of the great difficulties I've always found in writing about and debating matters of religion is that when one talks to people who have a deep and a sincere religious commitment, one finds that one's efforts to define things, like, for example, the word God or the word faith, or even indeed the word religion, is that your opponent too often says, that's not what I mean by faith, or that's not what I mean by God, or that's not how I understand religion. And so, as I put it in that book that Simon mentioned, it is tremendously like having a boxing match with an extremely large jelly. Because every time you land a punch somewhere, it's got a bit of blue out on the other side, and then resumes its shape afterwards. And so it is a very difficult opponent. But it is important to try to get some clarity. And the only clarity that can surely stand up is from the sources of the great religions themselves who tell us what faith is like. So I can cite two texts from the Christian tradition, for example. The story in the Acts of the Apostles about doubting Thomas, who didn't believe that Jesus had risen from the dead. And when he saw Jesus again, he was obliged to stick his fingers into the wound in Jesus' side so that he could believe. And Jesus said to him, blessed are those who believe without having seen. That faith, having faith, which, as you remember from St. Paul, is one of the three great virtues of Christianity, faith, hope, and charity. But faith is believing without evidence. Faith is believing, and now my second text comes into play. Soren Kierkegaard says that faith, to take the leap of faith, even in the face of evidence, even in the face of absurdity, is a great achievement in religion. It is a great virtue of religion, to believe even in the teeth of counter-evidence. And of course this is something which has been iterated throughout the tradition. Some of the early patristic fathers said, well, it's so absurd that I'm going to believe it. It must be true because it's so unbelievable. And this is regarded as a virtue, indeed a cardinal virtue or a great virtue. So faith as choosing to believe, even if you don't have evidence even against the evidence. That's what we're going to have to mean, I think, by faith if we take it from, so to speak, the horse's mouth itself. So is atheism a faith? Well, no. We need to challenge three concepts. The three concepts in play are faith, knowledge, and rationality. Sometimes people say, in defense of their religious commitment, that one cannot know that there is no God. You can't know that there is no God, they say. You can't prove that there is no God. And take that rather triumphantly to mean that it's okay to believe that there is one. Now you can see that there is actually a very large gap between the two, but it is taken to be an encouragement. Now, I'm going to come back to this point because so some of you may have come across these arguments before, but as you know, it's always worth iterating good arguments. That one actually can prove that there is no deity. I'll do that for you in a minute, if I may. But I just want to clarify these notions about faith, knowledge, and rationality. Because if you dip your toe into the great philosophical tradition of debate about theory of knowledge, about what it is to know something, how one might defeat skeptical arguments intended at their best and most cogent to persuade us that there are always potential defeaters to our knowledge claims. So you say, you might want to say that you know that there is a lectern here made of wood with a microphone on top and so on. I say to you, how do you know? You say, see it. If you were to come up here, you could knock on it and hear wooden noises. You could nibble it and have varnishy tastes. You could use all five senses and by their means detect the presence. And that's how you say you know. And then, of course, I could run all the standard arguments that we read in first-year philosophy from Descartes, where you could be, deceived, your perceptual capacities could be misleading you. You might now actually be asleep and dreaming, or having a nightmare that you're in a lecture on atheism. So for all these reasons, they would defeat your claim to know such a thing. And so one conclusion that one can readily come to is that actually knowledge is not to the point. Since it is so easy to undermine even such straightforward knowledge claims as that, perhaps we shouldn't be interested in trying to define knowledge, or at any rate define it in an over-demanding way, other than the colloquial sense in which we all say that we know it's rained today, or that Everest is the highest mountain, or that the Norman Conquest happened in 1066. These are all items of conventional knowledge. There's a perfectly good use of the word, of the phrase to know in that connection. But if you are going to be very exigent about the concept of knowledge, and in a debate like this it's important to be demanding, perhaps we should say knowledge is not the point. What is to the point, rather, is rationality, the rationality of belief. And I can give you a very, very simple, straightforward example of this. Supposing every time I've been in the rain, and today actually, without an umbrella, I've got wet. And this has happened every time, many, many times recurringly. But, you know, I've read David Hume. I know about induction and the fallibility of induction. So I think to myself, well, maybe next time I go in the rain without an umbrella, I won't get wet. There's no guarantee from any number of repeated past instances. So if it's pouring with rain outside, and I sally forth without an umbrella, what are the neighbours going to think? They're going to think I'm in Egypt. They're going to say, that's irrational. Because you know from past experience, if you were to take all the evidence that you have and proportion it to your action, to your choice of action, then you will be doing the rational thing. Because rationality has as its first part the word ratio, which means proportion. Proportioning the evidence that you have to the actions you take or the beliefs that you hold. This is why Bertrand Russell said, it's not what you believe, but why you believe it that really, really matters. And rational belief, belief which is premised on having good evidence, which has stood up to hard reasoning, is the kind of belief which you can hold and act on, premise on further reasonings, use as the basis for your behaviour, providing, of course, you're always open to counter-evidence or for better arguments which will make you change your mind. It's the mark of rationality to be proportional and to be open to better and stronger cases being made against what you decide to believe. And this, of course, is characteristic of science at its best. We always think, and it may be kind of idealized rendering of what science is, but then actually most scientific practice does approximate the ideal of this methodology. But you come up with an hypothesis, you test it as rigorously as you possibly can, you check the parameters of your experimental method, you subject your results to public scrutiny, other people who are jealous they will get the Nobel Prize, not you, so they really subject their tests to very rigorous examination. If everything stands up and you can't infirm the hypothesis that's been repeatedly and publicly tested, then you can premise it in further work, but it may turn out in that further work that the original hypothesis needs adjustment or needs revision, and then you should be open to doing it. And that is the unimpeachable method of science, and it is par excellence the method of rationality, being rational, proportional to the evidence. Now, in the light of that view of the nature of rationality, you can do what I promised a moment ago, and that is that you can prove that there are no gods or goddesses. Very much in the same way, by the way, that you might prove, using the same techniques I'm just about to offer you, that there are no fairies at the bottom of your garden. I mention this in a non-trivial way, by the way, because you'll be aware, some of you, that belief in fairies was extremely widespread and very earnest right up into the early part of the 20th century, in this country and probably in other countries as well. There was a wide literature about them, a lot of beliefs about them. They had names. They were a damn nuisance. They curdled the milk and stole your shoelaces when you weren't looking. In fact, they were a bit more believed in than God was, because God was only believed in on Sundays. The fairies were being used every day. And in fact, by one of those great ironies of history, the Church of England founded its primary schools in the 19th century to combat superstition. They meant about fairies, but they didn't realise that people might expand the arguments to other supernatural agencies as well, unintended consequences. Well, the argument that you might run in proving that there are no fairies at the bottom of the garden is exactly parallel to the argument that you might use for the Olympian deities, the Norse gods, indeed any number of gods, including one that you care to think about. So what I'm just about to offer you applies to the deity of the great traditional religions that we have now, as well as all the other superstitious ones, which have fallen by the wayside in the past. As follows. The concept of proof in a formal deductive system is the concept of a conclusion following with logical necessity from the premises. And you will be aware, those of you who study any form of systems, mathematical or logical, that deductions are in fact simply rearrangements. So if you take a very simple example of a deductive argument, very familiar, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, you see that the conclusion is just a rearrangement of the premises. You've just taken the concepts and reorganized them as your conclusion. In fact, all deductions are circular. There are instances of a fallacy known as petitio principii, because the information is already implicit in the premises. And what a deduction does is it sorts out the information in the premises to give you your conclusion. And this, of course, is the basis of every detective story you've ever read or seen, because, you know, the detective has all the facts, they're all pinned up on the corkboard, and thinks about them at 2 o'clock in the morning with a glass of whiskey, and suddenly they all fall into shape, and there you've got the culprit. Miss Marple was very good at it. So this is the nature of deductive in formal context, of proof in formal context. But in the empirical contingent context, proof means something different. Proof means test. If you go to a steel foundry, you will see that every 100 rods that are produced in the foundry are taken away and cooled down, and then they are subjected to loading to see how much loading they will bear before they fracture. This is known as proving the steel, testing the steel. It's the use of the word proof that we make when we say the proof of the pudding is in the eating. That is, the test of the pudding is in the eating. It's also the use we make of the word proof when we say the exception proves the rule. And of course, conveniently, most people think that this means that the rule is okay if there's an exception to it, but actually, of course, what it really means is that the exception tests the limits of applicability of a rule. So in that sense of proof or test, of rigorously testing something to prove that it will stand up, all I need to do is to remind you of the lovely story offered by Carl Sagan, the dragon in the garage story. You all remember this? Your friend says to you, I've got a dragon in my garage. You say, oh, God, I know, it's a dragon. Your friend says, well, this one is invisible. You say, oh, well, in that case, can we hear its leathery wings flapping? Your friend says, no, this one's silent. So you say, oh, well, could we put some talcum powder on the floor of the garage and see its footprints? No, this one never lands on the floor. Well, could we at least feel its fiery breath? No, this one's got cool breath. And so on and so on. Now, what you're trying to do there is you're trying to prove, that is, test the claim that there's a dragon in the garage. You can't see it, you can't hear it, it lands, you can't sense it by any of your 5 senses. Perhaps you even say to him, could I, you know, we've got telescopes, microscopes, and oscilloscopes, perhaps we can get a dragonoscope in there and see if that will pick up its presence. And your friend says, nah, this dragon is invisible to dragonoscope. So every endeavor that you make to test the presence of the dragon in the garage fails. So you have tested, and you have found that it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Now, precisely the same thing would happen if you were to take seriously the thought that at the bottom of your garden there might be some fairies and gnomes, you know, responsible for the daffodils that come up in the spring and other things. And you could devise a number of experiments. You know, you could put motion-sensitive cameras at the bottom of the garden, which are so programmed that they don't not trigger the dog. You could, you know, there are all sorts of things that you could try to do. And if what you got was complete failure to get any of the tests to deliver anything that would provide some kind of support for the hypothesis in question, then the rational thing to do, the proportional thing to do, is to say there ain't no such thing. There are no fairies at the bottom of it. So it's about the rationality of belief, not about absolute knowledge. Knowledge, I think, could well be restricted to the formal case. You can know that 1 + 1 = 2 if you have the definitions of 2 that are standard in arithmetic to the base 10. So then you could know that 1 + 1 = 2. But in the case of knowing what the orbital velocity of Mars is around the Sun, for example, as a result of calculation, deduction, and observation, then perhaps it's much better to say that this is a rationally supported belief, powerfully rationally supported in many cases. In other cases, less so, more open perhaps to revision. But anyway, always a matter of the proportioning of the claim we make to the evidence that we have. So that is really what's at issue here. Not knowledge, but proof in that sense. Proof in the sense of rigorous testing and of looking for the sorts of evidence that will make sense of a claim. Now, in the case of claims about supernatural agencies of some kind in our world, the proof, of course, isn't that you could devise a test. There isn't a sort of godoscope that you could set up somewhere in the hope that it might see a passing deity or two and record its presence. But here, you have firstly to look at the traditions and what claims the traditions make. Familiarly, David Hume did this in his essay of miracles, where he said, it would be, if I were to balance the probabilities, that is to think about whether it's more likely that somebody is deluded or lying or befuddled or stricken by too much faith when they report a miracle than the miracle itself, then I would go with the former rather than with the latter. It's far more likely that somebody is deluded or misled than that a suspension of the laws of nature should happen locally and temporarily anywhere in the world. But a marvellous remark was made by Mark Twain. He said, when a golfer claims a hole-in-one, he needs at least 2 witnesses. But all miracles ever known about in history have only ever had one. So golf is more exigent, really, than the claims of the faithful. So this is in essence the point that Hume was making about testing or proving, in that sense, of proof claims about miracles. So in the great debate in the 18th century about the so-called evidences of Christianity, the point was Christianity depends on its miracles. It depends on the miracle of the virgin birth and the resurrection from the dead, which was salvific, effecting the atonement between God and man. And there were other miracles as well, of course, but they pale into insignificance. I mean, raising Lazarus from the dead didn't save anybody else. Turning water into wine, we can all turn wine into water. So those miracles didn't matter that much. But those two were really essential to Christianity. And so there was a great debate about them in the 18th century. And that debate was a very clean, clear-cut example of how an attempt was made to test whether or not a certain view, a certain set of claims would stand up to scrutiny. But one can do this in a much, much more general way. One can, for example, look back across the landscape of religions in general and ask ourselves the question, how is it that religions arose and what is the nature of religious belief? But it's significant to do this because when you stand back from the history of religion in human thought as a way of evaluating or testing the likelihood of its claims, you notice something surprising. The surprising thing is that the 2 great religions of today's world, Christianity and Islam, are very young. They both date from about the 4th century and the 7th century of the Common Era. And I say the 4th century in the case of Christianity because, as you will know, the Emperor Constantine decriminalized Christianity in 313 AD, the Edict of Milan, and in 370 AD, the Edict of Thessalonica. It had become the one and only official religion of the Roman Empire, so that was pretty quick work. Although it did take a bit longer for the Christians to realize that they didn't need to devote so much energy to apologetics. Because, as you know, the patristic writers, the church fathers of the early history of the church, wrote many works attempting to persuade a skeptical population of the Mediterranean world of the claims of the Christian religion. But they gave up this attempt by the high medieval period, by which time it was just simply a crime not to believe it, and you could really end up being turned into toast if you didn't. So that does save a lot of writing and publication. Well, the fact that Christianity became the dominant outlook of the European mind, and of course of the Middle Eastern mind, because that really was the home of Christianity among the Nestorian Christians until Islam, and then Islam itself. And these 2 religions, therefore, are very young. And they are rather different from the way religions were before them. With the exception, in the Christian case, of the mystical cults like Orphism, religion in the ancient world was a public matter. It comes, of course, from the very word religion comes from the Latin religio, religere, which means to bind or to together. And the great religious observances of the Roman world, for example, were acts of public or community cohesion, bringing together the very disparate peoples, disparate ethnicities, disparate faiths and traditions of the Roman Empire into sort of great public festivals which gave them their sense of bonding in citizenship. And if you go back much further than that, if you look at the evidence in mythologies and you compare them to the animistic beliefs in some societies today, which what's commonly described as Stone Age societies, but I think that nomenclature has moved on. You can see something of the origins of religion in non-religion. That the very, very early religions sprang out of the best efforts that our forebears made to make sense of the world around them, to provide some kind of explanatory structure, perhaps also to find a way, some technology really for dealing with it. Now you can imagine how our very early forebears had one conceptual instrument to try to explain how nature works, and that is their own felt capacity as agents, as being able to do something, make something happen. Pick up a stone, throw it into a pond, it makes a splash. You were the cause of that. So what causes the wind or the thunder or the growth of the plants? But it must be some agency. It's a very natural thing to think, to impute agency to nature. And indeed, when you look at the ancient mythologies, the nymphs and the dryads were actually in the streams, in the trees. The gods were in nature themselves. Very, very natural thing to think. Even today, if you walk on your own into a grove of oak trees, and you hear the breeze passing through the leaves above your head, it sounds like the whispering of many voices. And you can understand how the Greeks thought that oak groves were very, very sacred places, because there you could actually hear the gods talking. Well, these very natural things for our forebears to think. And I'm personally convinced also that, eating a magic mushroom by mistake, eating something that fermented without you realizing what the effects would be, having a nightmare, having an epileptic fit, gave some people the sense that they had broken through the membrane between nature and supernature, between our world and the world of those agencies, and actually got into contact with them. It's even more likely, however, that some bloke, and I'm sure it was some bloke, thought to himself, if I can persuade all the members of my tribe that I can get in contact with these agencies, then I'm going to get all the money and all the girls. And that was probably why religions became formalized, because of course it wouldn't have taken the temporal powers very long to see the great value in having invisible policemen. You can see what you do even when you're on your own in the dark. And that does help with some control over human behavior. So it's natural enough to see how evolutions began to evolve. And evolve they most certainly did. Those mythologies placed the deities in nature right around us, in the trees and streams. As our forebears got to know more about the trees and streams, so the deities went to mountaintops. Mountaintops are very sacred in a lot of the early historical religions. Indeed, Moses is God as a burning bush on a mountaintop. They remember that the Jews were guided by a pillar of smoke by day, so it's not unlikely that their early god was a volcano god. But when our forebears got to the top of the mountains and had a peek and they didn't find very many gods up there, where did the gods go? It's a kind of geography, as we got to know more and more about our world, so there was a sort of recession of the deities, further and further. And now that we know that the world is round, so no way is up, even the idea of ascent into heaven has become figurative. So where is God now? Well, not in the sky, but beyond space and time altogether. It's a very natural place for the gods to go off into if you now have satellites in the So you look back across the history of religion and you notice how religions change. Religions change very dramatically through history in order to accommodate themselves. A wonderful example of this is, if you read St. Paul, the very earliest documents of Christianity, you will see there that he says two things. He says, firstly, of course, that the parousia, the second coming of the Messiah, is imminent. It's going to happen very, very soon. In fact, it says in the Gospels, you must keep the wicks of your lamps trimmed, because the Messiah is going to come back next week or next month. Anyway, this is why the New Testament, in its practical ethics, tells you, give away everything you own, don't make any plans, don't marry and have children because there's no future. If your family disagree with you, and boy, they will if you give away all your money, then you've got to turn your back on them. This was a sincere view about living at the end of history. Now, when after about 4 centuries, people were looking at their sundials and finding out that things were taking a bit longer than they thought, they had to import a much richer, more livable ethics than that. The ethics of the New Testament have driven thousands of people into the desert farmers, the hermits of the desert, people cut off their genitals and start trying to live according to those prescriptions. And of course it didn't work. So where did that richer ethics come from? Well, of course from Greek philosophy. What we think of as the concept, for example, of the Christian gentleman is just the megalopsychos of Aristotle. In which megalopsychos is magna anima, great soul, magnanimous person is the ideal of the ethical, the kind, generous and sympathetic individual. And that comes from the Nicomachean ethics of Aristotle and his society. But also, much more to the point, St. Paul, you may remember, said that the saints and martyrs will see no corruption. You remember that phrase? This was because as a Jew, he believed that when you die, you were buried in the grave, and the Messiah comes, the grave is open, we all come out. It's the bit of St. Paul I like best, because he says, we will have to be clothed in a new body, so I want a six-pack and a can. And the saints will not rot in the grave. Now, 400 years later, when Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire, and churches were being built everywhere, and temples being taken over and rededicated to Christianity, the church wanted relics. They wanted the bodies of saints and martyrs in the hope of miracles. They dug them up. They found to their dismay that they had all rotted. And they weren't meant to, because St. Paul said that saints wouldn't rot. Indeed, it was taken in the Christian tradition for many, many centuries to be a mark of sainthood that you wouldn't rot. If you were reading Dostoevsky in the bath last night, you remember at the beginning of the Brothers Karamazov, Zosima, the holy monk, and he dies, unfortunately for him, in summer. And thousands and thousands of peasants come to see whether he's going to rot, whether he's really a saint. After a couple of hours, he begins to smell. They all go home in disappointment. This is a mark of the fact that in the Orthodox tradition, the idea that saints would not rot after death remained the same. So what was the response of the church to the fact that their saints and martyrs were just bundles of bones? Well, via Neoplatonism, they imported wholesale the Platonic doctrine of the immortality of the soul. This is 400 years into the Christian tradition, they come up with the idea of the immortal soul to deal with the problem about what happens when bodies are buried. And this is just an example of how things mutate, how things change, how religions adapt themselves to circumstances, and of course they continue to do so. The Church of England, and this is something for which all of us atheists are very grateful, have abolished hell. Just in case they turn out to be right. So there's no one else. And the Roman Catholic Church have abolished limbo, which is where the souls of unbaptized babies used to go, you know. And this is a response to the fact that people regard both doctrines, hell, it's a bit on PC these days, we're all in favour of everybody else, so we don't like the thought that that's going to happen to everybody. And certainly, you know, we love babies, and we don't want that to happen. So the church said, well, we just can't have got that wrong for the last 2,000 years, so we just change that. And I mention these things because this is part of testing or proving the claims made by an institution which has the body of doctrine and which attempts to persuade us of it. So I won't go on, but one could go on for hours and hours about how you would prove and test these sorts of claims. But I will leave to you the further thought on that matter. The essential thing about atheism is that it simply denotes a position of not having a certain kind of belief or one of any of a range of beliefs. It is, and this is a point which is now surely very, very familiar, that atheism is to theism what not collecting stamps is to stamp collecting. If you're a theist, you have a positive commitment. You believe something. You believe in the Norse gods or the Olympian gods or some god anyway. But an atheist is somebody who just simply doesn't do that. He doesn't play golf, doesn't collect stamps. He's just not in the same terrain as somebody who has a positive view of that kind. Now, people confuse the position. We always talk about new atheists. There have been atheists in India for thousands of years, great traditions of thought there, for example, and there have been plenty of intelligent people who haven't been persuaded by thought of the gods. Like Plato, they took the view that ordinary people ought to be persuaded that there are gods, because it keeps them behaving well and also being prepared to go into battle, because they think they will go to Valhalla or something afterwards. Not the case of Plato, of course, but not into the Aspid and others. But there's nothing new about atheism. It's simply a position of not being orientated towards having a certain kind of typical, one of the typical range of beliefs. So it must be distinguished from anti-theism. My late and very much lamented friend Christopher Hitchens, Hitch used to say that he was both an atheist and an anti-theist, that is, against people who have theistic commitments, particularly those who were zealous in their commitments and who wanted to impose them on other people by violence if necessary. So that was the position that Hitch particularly took. And it's quite interesting when you look at the number of books that have been published in the last dozen years or so. There have been about 10, I suppose, by Hitchens and Dawkins and Sam Harris and Dan Dennett and various others, which have been immensely influential in this debate. I should just point out to you that quite literally thousands of books are published of theistic tendency every year, showing you how to pray and how an angel visited you, my little boy when he was born and so on. There are literally thousands of theistic, pro-theistic books. Just 10 or a dozen or so by non-theists, by atheists or anti-theists. It really, really gingers the debate up in the last 12 years or so, and for a very good reason, which we can address in the question and answer session, perhaps. But Hitchens regarded himself as an anti-theist as well as an atheist. And he is also, therefore, a militant secularist. Now, you can be a militant secularist, but you simply cannot be a militant atheist, any more than you can be a militant non-stamp collector. I can imagine what that's like. I don't collect stamps. So atheism is just a sort of a negative position. And actually, of course, the word atheism is the word coined by theists to describe people who won't share their view. And it used to be, and indeed in many parts of the world, in fact in the United States of America, where atheists are the most hated group in society, more than any other group in society. They're the most hated group. There's only one member of Congress who confesses to being an atheist. But the atheist movement in the United States of America is now learning a lesson from the very, very successful gay rights movement, which is that if you say that you're out in power as an atheist, there are enough other people who will be liberated into joining the movement, because there will be, of course, literally scores of thousands of people who go off to church every Sunday with their families, but not signed up for it. And we see in the Pew polling data in the United States that now a third of people under the age of 30 are nuns. These are the people who tick the NONE box. So they're known as nuns, but they're people being asked about their religious affiliation. So the nuns are on the increase in the So the theists have coined this word atheist. And of course, those of us who don't share a theistic outlook, who for the kinds of reasons I've been outlining, rational reasons, assessment of the sorts of claims that religions might make, looking at the nature of religion and its history, coming to the conclusion that this is a function of, a product of the infancy of our species, attempt to explain things which have become hardened into institutions used by temporal powers or systems of control, that in all these ways, religion has become very dominant in the course of history. Since the 18th century, of course, in the Christian world anyway, it has ceased to be so dominant. The Islamic world now would appear to be going through terribly difficult times with itself about the pressure of a globalizing, more secular world on its traditions and beliefs. Tragically, most of the atrocities, most of the violence associated with Islam today is Muslim violence, as you know, and the vast majority of the deaths are within the Islamic community itself. And this is very characteristic of what happened in Christianity a number of centuries ago. I mean, it's a sort of a cliche now to say that it looks as though history is repeating itself in this way, but it was certainly true that around the time of the Reformation, Christianity went through a tremendously bloody struggle with itself before it finally became too weary, in at least most cases, to think that the solution of the sword was superior to the solution of the debate. So where we are now is this. I would much rather describe, if I asked to describe myself, rather than use the word atheist, I would rather use the word naturalist. That is somebody who believes that the universe is a realm of natural law, and that the sciences between them might give us great advances in understanding our universe, our world, ourselves in it. as natural creatures. But then, of course, if you use the word naturalist, people think you take the clothes off and run around. So you have to use a different expression, and there is a wonderful old expression which is free thinker. That is somebody who tries to think without preconceptions, or at any rate with a sufficient amount of intellectual integrity to have one's assumptions and preconceptions challenged, and to think hard about the challenge. And when the arguments are good and the evidence is strong, to change one's mind. And that is what is meant by rationality, being rational, trying to hold rational beliefs, trying to think things through. And the sort of final point about that is that, of course, it can be very challenging for people to have this open-endedness, this open texture to our understanding of things. Not to have a neat story, a story which tells us about the beginning, gives us an understanding of what we're to do now, and gives us a promise about the end. We human beings love narratives, beginning, middle, and an end, a nice, neat, closed box. It's an extremely telling point that the major doctrines and demands of any major religion can be explained to anybody of normal intelligence in less than half an hour. But it takes years to understand physics. And this is the great difference in our world today, that the scientific mindset, which is open textured, which lives with real doubt, we're not sure yet, we're trying to devise tests. We test something, and my very, very good friend Tajinder Verdi, who led the compact muon solid experiment at CERN, said to me after they got the evidence that suggested that there is a particle at the Higgs level of energy, the Higgs boson, he said to me, do you know what, it would have been even more exciting if we hadn't found it, because then that would have told us that we were wrong about the basic model of the atom, and we would really have to start again. And he regarded that as exciting. It had been on the edge of ignorance, being at this vertiginous level of not knowing things, and not having found answers, feeling that there's a rich exploration to conduct. But a different kind of mindset tells us that we want closure, we want a neat story, a narrative, something that will satisfy us in our understanding of the world. And finally, of course, people talk about the basis of our ethics and of meaning in life. I'm actually quite often asked by taxi drivers what I do. I say I teach philosophy. Notice the very careful choice of words. If I say I am a philosopher, it's a bit like putting yourself in the first 11 of Manchester United along with Plato and Aristotle. So I say I teach philosophy. They think that means I am one, so there's a pause. They always, you kind of hear them thinking, what the heck does a philosopher do when he does something another? That is what a philosopher does. So then they say, all right, Governor, what's the meaning of life? And I say, I know the answer to that question. Not as a result of my feeble endeavours, but because of the great rich resource that philosophy is. It gives us the answer to the question of what life's meaning is. And so it does give you an opener for the conversation. So the point about an atheistic standpoint, if you are an atheist, as I said earlier, quite likely to be a secularist as well, but you are certainly going to be tempted by humanism with a small h. Humanism is not a doctrine. It's not a set of prescriptions and proscriptions, apart from one request or demand, which is to think for oneself, to take responsibility for really thinking things through and trying to make sense of how one is going to, with self-understanding, is going to live a life which is flourishing and good to live and good in effect on others, and has what is so fundamental to any well-lived life, and that is good relationships at its heart. Now that is the real task. When you go back and read the philosophers of antiquity, they all say in the post-Aristotelian schools, they all focused on this question, how should we live? And that is the great philosophical demand that really all of us are challenged by. And it is one which humanists are in the business of answering. Because if you have made a faith commitment of some kind, all those answers are already in place. And you're not going to think for yourself, you're going to live somebody else's idea of what a good life is. Thank you very much.
don't have any empirical evidence, so it will be a belief without evidence. But that's how you define faith. I don't see why that's a criticism rather than just a specification.
Yeah, I supplemented it by saying that you don't have empirical evidence, but you don't have any other reasons too. The whole point of testing is looking not just for something that counters evidence. I mean, every hypothesis specifies or should specify what would counters evidence for or against it. This is the old Popper point. I'm just being the LSE. So the old Popper point that if an hypothesis is consistent with any evidence to or against, then of course it's an empty hypothesis. So on the evidence point, but there's also the reasons point. We want a coherent, cogent, persuasive story. And you actually raise a very interesting point, because in all our discussions and arguments, and this is particularly true of philosophy, there are a range of things that one can hope for as the outcome of an argument, when you put an argument. One is that you hope that you can coerce your audience into accepting the conclusion. So this will happen with a knockdown deductive proof. But this very, very rarely happens in life or in logic for that matter. So if you don't get a coercive proof, then you want perhaps to get a very persuasive one. And you can sometimes give extremely powerfully persuasive sets of reasons supported by evidence that would make somebody drop a certain view or accept a certain view. That also happens, it does happen, but perhaps not as often as we would like. And so more weakly, we can then hope and expect that we might give reasons for people to be inclined to accept the view that we're making. So from coercion to persuasion to inclination. But it also happens, by the way, that you sometimes put an argument which is pretty feeble, so people are left neutral about it, or which is even worse than people that makes them believe the opposite, because you really gave them the wrong kinds of reasons altogether. So persuasion and inclination are the two things that you can most hope for. But in order to get that, it's a total package. You've got empirical evidence you need to reduce, you've got good reasons, you have to test the claims made in every way open to you. And in the case of religion, as I say, you test those claims by looking at what is claimed and how they fit into the historical frame.
Very good, thank you. So hands up. There's one here. Robert.
In light of what you were just saying, and especially in regards to the debate between theists and atheists, I come to find that there's a great lack of honesty between both parties in a lot of intellectual discourse, i.e. most of the world regards religion to be like an institutional powerhouse of inconsistent morals, yet time is advertising for truths, whereas the likes of atheists and secularists are more so labelled as a denunciation towards superstition, as opposed to a final destination, as a following of intellectual inquiry. Religious people get a lot of criticism because there are a lot of contradictions, which they kind of fueled by their own confirmation bias. I'd like to hear, are there any instances of kind of cognitive dissonance from the atheists, and especially anti-theists, considering you mentioned Christopher Hitchens, that you find actually make the conversation in progression between both parties like unnecessarily difficult?
Thank you very much.
Okay, but a complicated question on this one. I think the experience that people have when they debate across this divide, the theist, anti-theist, or atheist-theist divide, is one in which there could be great areas of agreement, for example, on social and ethical matters. I once debated with Rowan Williams, in fact, some years ago. In fact, I twice done it with him, because he invited me to a discussion with him about Dostoevsky's ethics. He wrote a book about Dostoevsky, a rather good one. And then later on, I asked him to return the favour to come and debate with me about something that I'd written. And it was an hour-long debate in the Royal Festival Hall, and the word God wasn't mentioned until 5 minutes from the end. So there was a great deal of agreement on matters of ethics and of society, about human concerns and so on. And it sometimes seems that the difference is really very small and nugatory, in the sense that only the people who sort of shut up about their religious beliefs or their atheism would just get on with the areas of agreement. But when you press them, I'm afraid, you find that underlying them there are these major structural differences in the reasons that people might give for holding the views they do. So however friendly and collegial the debate may be, ultimately, of course, the differences are very deep, and there are those metaphysical differences that I mentioned, plus all the consequences that might flow from them for the nature of society itself. And you have only to look at history to see how, grant all the good that has arisen out of people who have a sincere faith commitment and do good works on that basis, but look also at all the tremendous amount of power. And one reason why some secularists are very militant is because they want to try to confront the endeavours that are current anyway, to impose again religious hegemony over the way we think and act.
But the question is also about the cognitive dissonance on the part of the atheists. And one area that could obviously be brought up with respect to the kind of argument you use is the emphasis on rationalism and on that balanced judgment and so on. But what if that is a dimension that is essentially not involved in religious belief? So that you're asking it, demanding it, or expecting it, is expecting it to be the sort of thing it's not.
Right. Well, what one recognises and accepts, and it is part of the great difficulty about the possibility of debate between the two sides, that in fact, perhaps all religious motivation is at very least non-rational. So that is a difficulty. There is a deep distance there.
Okay, well, at the top, please,
Thanks. Just to sort of consider, there's a very important psychological element here as well, which we haven't, of course, explored, which is that these totalitarian belief systems, some more totalitarian than others, have a very effective grip on people's minds, largely, I guess, because they capture those minds before they have developed rational faculties as children. And I just wondered whether you had any practical recommendations, because unfortunately these issues are quite urgent in our society. So practical recommendations for how we can challenge these totalitarian belief systems and enable people to question once they've become hardwired effectively.
thank you.
Thank you. You give the answer in the question, actually, which is, I'm afraid it's going to be, as the French say, ouvrage de longue haleine, the work of long breath. But if one were to abolish faith schools, take religious education out of schooling, it might be a help. And as you point out, the major religions know that if you were to approach an intelligent 20-year-old who never ever heard about religion or encountered any of the religious traditions, they'd have a pretty tough time persuading them of them. And so they do need to proselytize small children, and that's by far the major way that religions survive. Because by far the religious majority of religious believers have the religious belief of their parents. So that's a very, very speaking factor. We're quite right. And so it's difficult to dissuade people who have made an emotional commitment, have a great deal of emotional investment, especially in those more totalizing religions. Roman Catholicism and Islam share in common this power to grip the young mind and to keep a grip even when people give up or move away from the faith or become less observant. I mean, it's no joke to say that somebody can be a Catholic atheist and they're still Catholic despite being one. And that's because of the way they view things. So it's very, very difficult to do it. And it's another speaking fact that people who we describe as moderate in their religious outlook are so precisely because they so cherry pick the religion they belong to. I mean, if you were to say ask a Christian, do you go around stoning gays? They would say, certainly not, if they were a moderate Christian anyway. And that answer by itself shows you that what they've done is, well, many people don't read the Bible, but the bits that they do read, they pick the bits that you can live with and which are okay and seem sort of user-friendly, and then all the bits that aren't are simply ignored. The fundamentalists, the zealots, the ones who take every word of the scriptures of their religion seriously and try to live by it, they're the ones who are most sincere.
Question down here.
Thank you. Thank you. I was just wondering if you could elaborate on perhaps religion as a metaphor or a self-help tool. So, for instance, someone may look at resurrection after a trauma thinking, with a belief in recovery and that you will recover. The same way as one might look at the Socratic method of anger management, or Epicurus or the Stoics for facing your worst fears in life. So if perhaps there's just that claim to religion from some people.
So the practical utility of having religious beliefs from a psychological point of view, yeah? Yes, I mean, it's certainly true. It works. What tends to happen is that people get inducted into a religion as children, and then when they get to adolescence, religious beliefs are a bit inconvenient when you're horny, so religious observance tends to fade away at about that point. Then later on in life, your parents die, you lose your job, a great disaster, you can't afford a lottery ticket, so you're feeling pretty miserable. You go on to your local church, and they're nice people there, and they welcome you in, and they give you the one thing that we all crave, which is a sense of belonging, community, and friendship. And then you kind of transfer that to the religion, and think that it's religion that's giving you the psychological support, when actually it's the practice of the religion that's doing it. And later reconverts to religion either become very zealous and a nuisance as a result, or it tends not to stick. Because the next thing that happens is that people start to drift into what I call the feng shui tendency. That they get fed up with church after a bit getting up on Sunday, so they go off and they buy a crystal. So it's that search for something that you can hold on to that gives psychological support, and that's exactly why people do sometimes go back to religion or convert when they're adults.
Yes, please.
I was wondering if, when you say faith, you seem to be focusing...
Where are you, by the way?
Here. When you say faith, you seem to be focusing more on religions that are defined, so Christianity, Muslim, but many people that I know will say that they believe in God, but their God is nondescript. It's God that doesn't ascribe to any religion in particular. And I was wondering if you saw more similarities between atheists and people who say they believe in God but do not subscribe to any religion. Because it seems to me that all the evidence, all the search for evidence you describe as proof that God doesn't exist, not only applies, but it mostly applies to the religions that have a clear definition and not just to the faith and something.
Well, the trouble with that, I suppose, is that people say, well, I believe. It's a very odd phrase, by the way, believe in God. I suppose it used to mean that one puts one's trust in God, so everything's going to be okay. You're using it, I think, more in the sense of believe that there is a God, or that there is some divine force or being. And the trouble with it is that it is so vague, so ill-defined, that it can be used to mean pretty well anything. So there are people who think, well, that there is a something, things are going to work out okay, or if I'm in trouble or danger, perhaps this thing would be of some use. I don't know, it's just too vague. And in fact, the very vagueness of it is a problem. And I sometimes say to those people, there are plenty of people who say things like, well, you simply can't make sense of the idea that anything exists at all unless something created it. And of course that just pushes the problem back from one rather mysterious thing to an even more mysterious thing, which you can easily demonstrate by saying, instead of saying God created the world, don't use the word God as if it were a name, use the name Fred. So say Fred created the world. And then suddenly you see it's a completely vacuous thing to say, because who the hell's Fred?
Okay, we've got time for two more, so three, one here and then one here. Yeah.
Hi, your colleague at New College of Humanities, Professor Dawkins, said in the Devil's Chaplain that whenever he hears the word postmodern in conversation, he stops it and asks them to define it. As someone who teaches postmodernism slightly, I thought that was quite a nice challenge to try and answer the question. What is the answer to the question, what is postmodernism? And the reason I ask it is it sounds to me, everything you said tonight sounds to me like a defense of postmodernism, but I just want to hear what your exact definition might be. And if so, do you think that postmodernism is in fact the best weapon against religions or anything that claims the symbol of truth?
dismayed to hear that, I have to say, because insofar as I understand what postmodernism is, one thing it is anyway is that it's friendly to forms of relativism. And I'm not particularly fond of it. Friendly to relativism, partly because I think that the great endeavour of the natural sciences is leading us in the direction of making some sense of the world around us, and also because I think that there are some universals relating to human nature and human condition which justify things like regimes of human rights and the rest. And that if that view requires of us that we think that there still is a grand narrative about the human good, then I'm all for it, and so I would reject the label. But thank you for putting it on me anyway. I think it's being a very tough chairman. You should come on to College Monday and meet Richard and see what he can persuade him.
Yes. Is it possible to be a humanist free thinker and a theist? For instance, if I were to say, having studied the ecosystem, the human body, and the like, I have accepted, evidentially, I have accepted the evidence proportionately that there is a designer or designers responsible for creation.
Well, you would be right that the designer in question is natural selection.
Rationality.